we call him Diddy.
Do you think she's been with him before?
Evil does not always arrive alone. Sometimes it walks beside someone else, encouraged, validated, and amplified. When two people form a bond rooted in violence, something changes. Responsibility is shared, doubt is silenced. Each act becomes easier than the last. These are not stories of coincidence or impulse, but of partnerships that fed on one another, growing darker with every step. In this series, we explore what happens when two lives intertwine in the worst possible way. Not legends, not myths, but real people, real victims, and real consequences. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you are intrigued to where this is going. And now, we start where many believe the modern myth of the killer duo truly took shape. Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. United States, early 1970s. By the time Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole met, neither of them was new to violence. What made their partnership so dangerous was not how it began, but how easily it formed. Two men shaped by abuse, neglect, and lifelong instability, found something disturbingly familiar in one another. And in that familiarity, restraint slowly disappeared. Henry Lee Lucas grew up in an environment defined by cruelty and humiliation. His childhood was marked by repeated physical abuse, emotional degradation, and severe psychological trauma, much of it inflicted by his own mother. Home was not a place of safety, but a place of fear. School offered no escape either, as Lucas was frequently bullied and isolated. From a young age, he learned that control was the only way to survive. Violence became internalized, not as an act of rage, but as a form of dominance. In the year 1960, after years of escalating tension, Lucas murdered his mother during an argument. The act was sudden, but the resentment behind it had been building for decades. He was arrested, convicted, and sent to prison. Yet, incarceration did not bring reflection or remorse. Instead, it reinforced his sense of alienation and his need for attention. Otis Toole's early life followed a parallel path, though his psychology developed differently. Raised in poverty and subjected to abuse, Toole struggled with his identity and sense of self from an early age. He was impulsive, emotionally volatile, and deeply insecure. Where Lucas sought control, Toole sought acceptance. He wanted to belong to someone, to matter to someone, no matter the cost. They met in Florida during the mid-1970s within the transient world of soup kitchens, shelters, and roadside communities. These were places filled with people who existed outside traditional systems of support. Lucas was older, articulate, and confident in his storytelling. Toole was younger, eager to listen, and desperate for connection. The imbalance between them was immediate and unmistakable. Lucas became the dominant voice. Toole became the follower. As they began traveling together, their relationship grew increasingly insular. They drifted across multiple states, including Texas, Florida, and parts of the Midwest. They lived out of cars, abandoned houses, and temporary shelters. There was no stable employment, no fixed address, and no accountability. Days blended into one another. Nights became longer. Isolation deepened. Years later, Lucas would claim that during this period, he and Toole committed an extraordinary number of murders. He spoke of hitchhikers, sex workers, and strangers encountered along highways and back roads. His confessions were calm, detailed, and relentless. Law enforcement agencies, overwhelmed by unsolved cases and desperate for answers, listened carefully. Otis Toole also confessed to murder, including crimes committed alongside Lucas. He described acts of shared violence, moments where one would initiate an attack while the other assisted, watched, or helped dispose of evidence. Their accounts varied, sometimes contradicting one another, but they consistently reinforced the idea of a murderous partnership. As the number of confessions grew, investigators began to notice troubling inconsistencies. Timelines did not align, locations conflicted. Some murders Lucas claimed responsibility for occurred while he was verifiably incarcerated or working hundreds of miles away. In several cases, the details he provided matched information that had already been shared with him during interrogations. The realization was slow but devastating. Lucas had been fed facts. He had been rewarded for cooperation with food, cigarettes, attention, and temporary comforts. The more he confessed, the more he received. Over time, the confessions became less about truth and more about performance. Lucas learned what investigators wanted and gave it to them. Still, not everything was fiction. At least several murders were confirmed to have occurred during the time Lucas and Toole were together. One of the most significant cases involved the murder of a young woman later identified as Deborah Jackson in Texas. That crime led to Lucas receiving a death sentence, which was later commuted to life imprisonment. Toole was separately convicted of murder in Florida and also sentenced to life in prison. Once incarcerated, their partnership deteriorated. Each man began distancing himself from full responsibility. Lucas often portrayed Toole as the true killer, suggesting that he merely observed or assisted. Toole, in turn, accused Lucas of manipulation and exaggeration. Their stories shifted depending on circumstance, audience, and perceived advantage. Psychologists later described their relationship as parasitic. Lucas fed on attention, notoriety, and the sense of power that came with being seen as monstrous. Toole fed on validation and belonging, even if that validation came through violence. Together, they amplified one another's darkest impulses. The damage extended far beyond their own crimes. Dozens of murder cases were closed based on false confessions. Families believed they had answers only to have those answers unravel years later. Investigations had to be reopened. Trust in law enforcement was shaken. The myth of the all-knowing confessor collapsed under scrutiny. Henry Lee Lucas died in prison in the year 2001. Otis Toole died behind bars several years earlier. Neither man ever provided a full accounting of the truth. Their legacy is not only violence, but confusion. A reminder that when two deeply damaged individuals reinforce one another, even reality itself can become distorted. And as unsettling as their story is, it would not be the last time a killer duo blurred the line between truth and illusion. Because the next pair would present something even more disturbing. Canada, Scarborough, and St. Catharines. Late 1980s into early 1990s, if Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole represented chaos and drift, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka showed how evil could hide behind routine, structure, and appearances. This was not a story unfolding on highways or in abandoned buildings. It happened in suburban neighborhoods, behind closed doors, and in a home that looked ordinary from the outside. Paul Bernardo grew up in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared intelligent, ambitious, and socially functional. He attended university, held steady employment, and blended easily into daily life. Beneath that surface, however, Bernardo harbored violent sexual fantasies that grew darker over time. During the late 1980s, those fantasies turned into action. Bernardo began targeting young women, often following them from bus stops late at night. He relied on planning rather than impulse, learning patterns and routines. His attacks became increasingly violent, and fear spread throughout the community. Police identified a serial offender and labeled him the Scarborough Rapist. Despite DNA evidence and public warnings, Bernardo remained unidentified for years. Karla Homolka entered his life while these crimes were ongoing. She was younger, outwardly cheerful, and deeply eager to be loved. Friends and family described her as kind, gentle, and eager to please. When she met Bernardo, the relationship quickly became intense. He dominated emotionally and physically. She responded not by resisting, but by adapting herself to his desires. Behind closed doors, the relationship was violent. Bernardo exerted control through humiliation, threats, and physical abuse. Homolka internalized the idea that loyalty meant participation. Over time, she stopped seeing herself as separate from his actions. She wanted to be essential. She wanted to be chosen. The first known victim within their partnership came from Homolka's own family. In the summer of 1990, Homolka and Bernardo drugged her younger sister, Tammy. The act was not accidental. It was deliberate. Homolka later claimed she wanted to offer Bernardo something that would satisfy him and strengthen their bond. Tammy died during the assault. Her death was ruled accidental, attributed to choking after alcohol consumption. No criminal investigation followed. Rather than stopping, the couple escalated. They married in the year 1991, posing for smiling photographs and celebrating with family and friends. Only weeks later, they abducted a teenage girl named Leslie Mahaffey. She was held captive inside their home, assaulted repeatedly, and eventually killed. The crime was planned, recorded, and shared between them. The following year, they abducted another teenage girl, Kristen French. She was taken in broad daylight, forced into their vehicle, and transported to their home. For days, she was subjected to continuous abuse. When she was finally murdered, both participated in disposing of her body. Throughout this period, Bernardo continued committing sexual assaults outside the home. Homolka knew. She helped clean up evidence. She reassured him. She stayed. What ultimately exposed them was not a confession, but accumulating evidence. DNA testing finally linked Bernardo to the Scarborough rapes. Hidden videotapes discovered inside the home documented the abuse and revealed Homolka's active participation. Facing prosecution, Homolka made a calculated decision. She cooperated with authorities, presenting herself as a victim of extreme abuse who had acted out of fear. Prosecutors, unaware of the full contents of the videotapes, accepted a plea deal. She testified against Bernardo in exchange for reduced charges. By the time the full extent of her involvement became clear, the agreement could not be reversed. Paul Bernardo was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault and murder. He received a life sentence and was designated a dangerous offender. Karla Homolka served a significantly shorter sentence and was eventually released back into society. The public reaction was immediate and enduring. Families of the victims felt betrayed. The case became a symbol of prosecutorial failure and moral outrage. Debates over agency, coercion, and responsibility continued decades later. Psychologically, their partnership was rooted in imbalance. Bernardo sought dominance and control. Homolka sought validation and belonging. Together, they created a closed system where violence was normalized, justified, and shared. Each reinforced the other's worst impulses. Each made the next act easier. Unlike earlier killer duos, their crimes were not clouded by false confessions or investigative uncertainty. The facts were clear. What remained difficult to understand was how such extreme violence could exist behind wedding photos, steady jobs, and suburban routines. Bernardo remains incarcerated. Homolka lives under a new identity, her presence still a source of anger and fear. Their story marked a shift in how the world understood killer duos. It showed that evil did not always look chaotic or unstable. Sometimes it looked organized, domestic, even loving. And as disturbing as that realization was, it would not be the last time a partnership blurred the line between intimacy and cruelty. Because the next duo would blend friendship, addiction, and violence into a pattern that left entire communities in California looking over their shoulders. United States, California's Central Valley, mid-1980s through late 1990s. If Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka showed how violence could hide behind domestic normalcy, the next duo revealed something different. A partnership forged not through romance, but through long familiarity, addiction, and shared cruelty. Lauren Herzog and Wesley Shermantine grew up together, and over time, that shared history became a weapon. Both men were raised in the small farming town of Linden, California. It was a quiet place, where most people knew one another and routine shaped daily life. Herzog and Shermantine lived on the same street. They hunted together, drank together, and spent long hours roaming the surrounding countryside. Their bond was not intense in an emotional sense, but constant. They were almost always together. From a young age, their behavior set them apart. Both were known for heavy drinking, drug use, and aggressive tendencies. Methamphetamine would eventually become central to their lives, earning them the nickname that would later define their crimes. The drug-fueled paranoia, impulsivity, and a growing appetite for violence. Unlike some killer duos, there was no single dominant personality. Shermantine was volatile, arrogant, and openly aggressive. Herzog was quieter, more reserved, but no less complicit. Their dynamic functioned through reinforcement. Each validated the other. Each removed the last barrier of restraint. The first confirmed murders occurred in the mid-1980s. 2 men were shot and killed in a remote area, their bodies left in a car. The crimes received little attention at the time, blending into the background of rural violence and unsolved cases. There was no immediate suspect, no clear motive. As years passed, the violence continued intermittently. Victims disappeared, rumors circulated. Locals whispered about the pair, describing them as dangerous, unstable, and unpredictable. Women in the area learned to avoid them. Men learned not to challenge them, but suspicion alone was not enough to bring consequences. The crimes escalated in the late 1990s. In the year 1998, a woman named Cindy Vanderheiden went missing after being seen with Herzog and Shermantine at a local bar. Her disappearance triggered renewed scrutiny. Witnesses came forward. Investigators began to re-examine past unsolved cases. Patterns emerged. Under pressure, Herzog began talking. He described murders that had gone uninvestigated for years. He spoke of shootings, stabbings, and bodies disposed of in remote locations. He placed Shermantine at the center of the violence, portraying him as the primary killer while framing himself as a participant who had gone along out of fear and loyalty. Shermantine denied responsibility, responding with threats and erratic behavior. He taunted investigators, sometimes hinting at hidden graves, sometimes denying everything. The contrast between the two men became sharper as the investigation progressed. Both were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. At trial, the dynamic between them remained consistent. Herzog cooperated. Shermantine resisted. Herzog appeared remorseful. Shermantine appeared defiant. Yet evidence tied both men to the crimes. Witness testimony, forensic findings, and Herzog's statements painted a picture of long-term, shared violence fueled by drugs and mutual reinforcement. Shermantine was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. Herzog was also convicted, receiving a lengthy prison sentence. For many, it seemed like the story had reached its conclusion. It had not. Years later, Herzog's convictions were overturned on appeal due to concerns about coercion during interrogations. He accepted a plea deal, resulting in a significantly reduced sentence. Public outrage followed. Families of the victims felt betrayed by a system that appeared to offer mercy where none was deserved. In the year 2012, shortly after being informed that Shermantine was willing to reveal the locations of additional victims' remains, Loran Herzog took his own life while on parole. His death ended any possibility of further testimony. Shermantine, from death row, continued to control the narrative. He claimed knowledge of dozens of burial sites, offering information selectively, sometimes in exchange for attention or favors. Some remains were eventually recovered. Others remained missing. Psychologically, their partnership was built on normalization. Violence was not discussed as shocking or exceptional. It was treated as an extension of boredom, anger, and intoxication. There was no ideological motive, no grand justification, only repetition. Herzog and Shermantine demonstrated how long-term proximity can erode moral boundaries. When violence becomes familiar, it stops feeling wrong. When it is shared, it stops feeling personal. Responsibility dissolves into companionship. Unlike earlier duos, they were not driven by fantasy or image. They did not seek notoriety. They did not construct elaborate narratives. They simply killed, returned home, and continued their lives as if nothing had changed. Their crimes left scars across communities that had once felt insulated from such darkness. Parents warned children. Locals questioned their assumptions about familiarity and trust. Wesley Shermantine remains incarcerated, still holding fragments of truth. Loran Herzog is gone, taking much of that truth with him. Their story serves as a bridge between eras, between domestic evil and drifting violence, between secrecy and exposure, and as the timeline continues forward, the pattern becomes unmistakable, because the next duo would operate in a different country under a different system, but driven by the same dangerous chemistry. Two friends, one ideology, and a city that would never forget the sound of hammers striking in the dark. China, multiple provinces, late 1990s into early 2000s. If earlier killer duos were driven by obsession, addiction, or emotional dependency, the story of Shen Chang-yin and Shen Chang-ping revealed something colder and more calculated. This was not violence born from impulse or fantasy. It was violence treated as a solution, a partnership built on survival, profit, and a complete absence of empathy. Shen Chang-yin was the older brother. Born in the mid-1970s, he grew up in rural China during a period of economic hardship and limited opportunity. His early adulthood was marked by repeated failure. Business ventures collapsed, financial pressure mounted. Each attempt to establish stability ended in debt and frustration. Over time, bitterness replaced ambition. The world, in his view, had offered nothing. Shen Changping, nearly a decade younger, grew up in his brother's shadow. He followed rather than questioned. Where Chang Yin planned, Changping complied. Their bond was rooted not in affection, but in obligation. Family loyalty was absolute, and obedience was expected without discussion. The first known killing occurred in the year 1999. According to later confessions, Shen Changyin murdered a man in their hometown following a personal conflict. The act forced the brothers to flee. From that moment on, they lived as fugitives, moving between provinces, avoiding detection, and surviving through deception. The killing was not an accident. It was a threshold. Once crossed, there was no return. As the years passed, survival became their central focus. By the early 2000s, the brothers developed a deliberate method. They targeted women, working as prostitutes. The choice was calculated. These women often lived transient lives, lacked strong support systems, and were less likely to be reported missing immediately. Their disappearances could be overlooked or delayed. Each crime followed a chillingly consistent pattern. A victim would be lured to a rented room or temporary residence. Once inside, she would be restrained. The brothers would force her to reveal bank information and personal details. Money was withdrawn, valuables were taken, and then, without hesitation, the victim was killed. The violence was methodical rather than emotional. Strangulation, stabbing, and dismemberment were carried out with efficiency, not rage. Bodies were destroyed using chemicals and disposed of through plumbing systems or remote locations. Evidence was minimized. Time was taken. This was not chaos. It was procedure. What elevated the horror of their crimes was the expansion of control beyond the brothers themselves. At one point, they spared a woman's life only after she agreed to assist them. Under constant threat, she was forced to lure additional victims, becoming both captive and accomplice. Violence became systemic, extending outward through fear. Between the years 2003 and 2004, the brothers murdered at least 11 women across multiple provinces, including Gansu, Shaanxi, Anhui, Inner Mongolia, and Hebei. After each killing, they relocated. New rooms, new identities. The pattern repeated with minimal variation. Kill, dispose, move on. There was no escalation in brutality because brutality was already complete. The crimes did not grow more violent, they simply continued. Their arrest came in the summer of 2004. Acting on a tip, police raided an apartment where the brothers were in the process of destroying another body. Chemicals, restraints, and physical evidence connected them to multiple murders. This time, there was no escape, no delay, no confusion. During interrogation, both brothers confessed. Their statements were direct and unemotional. They admitted to the murders without visible remorse. Financial desperation was cited as the primary motive. Killing, in their view, had become a tool. Victims were reduced to resources, money, opportunity, risk to be eliminated. Psychological evaluations later described their partnership as strictly hierarchical. Shen Changyin was the strategist and decision-maker. Shen Changping was the executor. There was no ideological justification, no belief system, no fantasy of righteousness. Only necessity, as they defined it. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Confessions were detailed and consistent. Forensic proof confirmed multiple crime scenes. Witness testimony established their movements across provinces. There was no ambiguity. Both brothers were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. They were executed by lethal injection in the year 2006. Unlike other killer duos, there was no prolonged public debate about guilt or sentencing. The scale, consistency, and brutality of their crimes left little room for doubt. What remained instead was a deeper unease. The realization that such violence had been sustained for years through planning, cooperation, and silence. Shen Changyin and Shen Changping represented a form of evil stripped of theatrics. There were no taunts, no desire for recognition, no attempt to shock. Their crimes were not expressions of identity or rage. They were transactions. They demonstrated how partnership can erase the final barrier to atrocity. When responsibility is shared, conscience weakens. When loyalty overrides empathy, morality collapses. Their executions ended the immediate threat, but they did not undo the damage. Families were left without closure. Entire regions were forced to confront how many disappearances had gone unnoticed. And as the timeline moves forward, the pattern does not end, because the next duo would bring violence across borders, driven not by profit alone, but by ideology, youth, and a hunger to be seen. Two teenagers, one shared hatred, and a city that would soon learn how quickly alienation can turn lethal. Estonia and Latvia, early 2000s. By the time Yuri Ustimenko and Dmitry Medvedev crossed into Estonia, they were already running from consequences. What followed was not a sudden descent into violence, but a deliberate transformation. Two young men, bound by ideology and mutual reinforcement, turned alienation into action and belief into bloodshed. Yuri Ustimenko was the dominant figure. Intelligent, articulate, and deeply resentful, he carried an inferiority complex forged through years of bullying and instability. He read constantly, gravitating toward literature that romanticized struggle and strength. Over time, his worldview hardened into something rigid and absolute. He believed weakness deserved eradication. He believed fear was a tool. Dmitry Medvedev was younger and more impressionable. Emotionally vulnerable and searching for direction, he attached himself to Ustimenko with near total loyalty. Where Ustimenko spoke, Medvedev followed. Their relationship was not equal. It was hierarchical. One commanded, the other obeyed. They met while enrolled in a naval institute in St. Petersburg. Both struggled to fit in. Both resented authority. When a wave of violent crimes committed by acquaintances drew scrutiny to their circle, the pressure mounted. Rather than face investigation or accountability, they fled. In the autumn of the early 2000s, Ustimenko and Medvedev illegally crossed into Estonia by swimming across the Narva Reservoir under cover of darkness. They used skills learned during training, covering their bodies and timing their movement to avoid detection. From the moment they arrived, they lived as fugitives. At first, survival was the goal. They relied on temporary housing, occasional work, and assistance from acquaintances. But financial instability returned quickly. Resentment deepened, and ideology began to merge with opportunity. The violence began with explosions. In the spring of the early 2000s, bombs detonated outside a hunting supply store in Tallinn. The blasts injured civilians and drew national attention. Markings left behind hinted at authorship. The message was deliberate. Fear was the point. Soon after, the killings started. Their first known murder was a taxi driver, shot at close range and robbed. The act was swift and calculated. There was no confrontation, no provocation, just execution. Days later, they entered a shop and killed again, this time using a firearm to eliminate witnesses and steal weapons. From there, the pattern escalated. They targeted ordinary people, shop workers, passers-by, drivers. Victims were selected for accessibility, not identity. The crime spanned multiple cities. Each attack was designed to reinforce control and spread fear. They avoided phones. They traveled by public transport. They stuck together at all times. What distinguished Ustimenko and Medvedev from earlier duos was their ideological framing. Violence was not merely a means to an end, it was a statement. They believed society was corrupt, weak, and deserving of punishment. Killing was framed as correction. Witnesses later described how Ustimenko spoke during the crimes, calm, directed, certain. Medvedev followed instructions without hesitation. When shots were fired, they moved as a unit. When escape was required, there was no debate. As their crimes accumulated, law enforcement intensified the search. The pattern was unmistakable. Two offenders, military discipline, escalating boldness. Public fear grew. Media coverage amplified the sense of vulnerability. Their final acts took them across borders. In the early summer of the early 2000s, they crossed into Latvia. Police closed in. During a confrontation with Latvian officers, Dmitry Medvedev was killed in a shootout. He died where he stood, still armed, still following orders that no longer existed. Yuri Ustimenko escaped. For weeks he remained on the run, crossing countries illegally and avoiding capture. Eventually, he was detained in Poland for border violations. Interpol confirmed his identity. He was extradited to Estonia to face trial. In court, the hierarchy became clear. Evidence showed Ustimenko as the planner and ideological driver. Medvedev had acted as the enforcer, executing instructions without deviation. Together, they were responsible for multiple murders and attempted murders across Estonia and Latvia. Ustimenko showed little remorse. He framed his actions as logical, even necessary. Psychologists later described him as ideologically rigid, emotionally detached, and deeply narcissistic. He saw himself as separate from those he killed, superior, correct. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The story of Ustimenko and Medvedev is not one of chaos or impulse. It is a case study in radicalization through companionship, one voice shaping another, one belief system reinforced through shared action. Alone, each man might have faltered. Together, they removed the final restraints. Their crimes forced an entire region to confront a new kind of threat. Young, mobile, ideologically driven, unpredictable. Medvedev's death ended his role in the story. Ustimenko remains incarcerated, still convinced of his own logic, still dangerous in belief, if no longer in action. Their partnership demonstrates how violence accelerates when ideology is shared rather than questioned, when certainty replaces doubt, when loyalty replaces conscience. And as the timeline continues, the pattern shifts once again, because the next duo would not be driven by ideology or youth, but by family ties and resentment. A partnership that would blur the line between home and crime, a mother, a husband, and a family that turned murder into routine. Russia, late 2000s into early 2010s. If earlier killer duos were driven by ideology, addiction, or youthful radicalization, the partnership between Inessa Tarverdieva and Roman Podkopayev revealed something even more unsettling. This was not a bond formed in rebellion or desperation. It was built inside a family, and over time, that family became a system where violence was taught, normalized, and enforced. Inessa Tarverdieva was the central figure. Outwardly, she appeared unremarkable. A mother, a former teacher, someone who blended easily into everyday life. But beneath that surface lived a deep and growing resentment toward authority, particularly law enforcement. Past relationships, perceived betrayals, and unresolved personal grievances hardened into a worldview where violence felt justified. In her mind, society had wronged her, and retaliation was not only acceptable, but necessary. Roman Podkopayev, her husband, played a different role. Trained as a dentist, he was methodical, quiet, and technically capable. He lacked Inessa's ideological fire, but he did not challenge it. Where she supplied motive and direction, Roman supplied execution and support. Their relationship was hierarchical. Inessa commanded, Roman complied. The crimes began gradually in the late 2000s. At first, they appeared isolated. A robbery here, a shooting there. Victims were attacked in homes, along highways, or while traveling. There was no clear pattern. Sometimes valuables were taken. Other times, they were ignored entirely. This inconsistency confused investigators. Financial gain did not fully explain the violence. What police did not initially understand was that these early crimes were rehearsals. The family used road trips as cover. Camping excursions and long drives through southern Russia allowed them to move across jurisdictions without raising suspicion. Vehicles became tools of opportunity. Victims were chosen not for who they were, but for how exposed they appeared. A parked car, a family pulled over at night, a quiet stretch of road. Over time, the partnership expanded. Inessa did not limit participation to herself and Roman. Gradually, her daughters were drawn in. Not as passive witnesses, but as active participants. Tasks were assigned. Roles were normalized. Violence was framed as necessary and inevitable. Inside the family, obedience replaced morality. Refusal was not an option. One of the most infamous cases involved a family stopped along a highway. Without warning, they were attacked. Firearms were used first. Knives followed. Parents and children were killed. The brutality shocked the nation. Investigators struggled to understand the motive. The valuables taken were minimal. The violence was excessive. That was the point. These crimes were not driven by profit. They were expressions of control, resentment, and dominance. Law enforcement officers were targeted deliberately, reinforcing Inessa's hatred of authority. Civilians were targeted to spread fear. Randomness became strategy. As the murders continued, the family refined their methods. Weapons changed, routes shifted, jurisdictions were crossed, they avoided routine. Each crime appeared isolated, disconnected from the last. Law enforcement agencies worked separately, unaware they were hunting the same perpetrators. Inside the family, control tightened. Inessa dictated behavior with absolute authority. Roman enforced structure. The children learned that participation meant survival. Over time, violence lost its shock. It became routine, an instruction to be followed rather than an act to be questioned. Between the late 2000s and early 2010s, the family was responsible for multiple murders and attempted murders across different regions. Victims included police officers, travelers, and entire families. The randomness was deliberate. Anyone could be a target. Everyone was vulnerable. Their capture came not through confession, but through accumulation. Ballistic evidence began linking scenes across regions. Witness accounts started to align. A vehicle was identified. Slowly, investigators began to see what they had missed. This was not a gang. It was not a pair of criminals moving together. It was a family. When arrests were finally made, the scale of involvement stunned the public. A mother, a father, children. The case shattered assumptions about who commits extreme violence and how it can be hidden behind domestic normalcy. During interrogation, Inessa Tarverdieva showed little remorse. She spoke openly about her hatred for police and society. She framed the murders as justified responses to a corrupt world. Roman Podkopayev remained subdued, often deferring to her, even in custody. The hierarchy that defined their crimes remained intact. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic links tied weapons to multiple scenes. Witness testimony reconstructed movements across regions. Confessions confirmed years of coordinated violence. The family's crimes were laid out in full, revealing a long campaign hidden behind the image of ordinary life. Sentences reflected the severity. Inessa received life imprisonment. Roman was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The daughters received reduced sentences due to their ages at the time of the crimes, though their involvement was undeniable. Psychologists later described the partnership as authoritarian. Inessa functioned as both ideologue and commander. Roman enabled and executed. Together, they created an environment where empathy was replaced by obedience and violence became instruction. Their case forced a reckoning, not just with the crimes themselves, but with the uncomfortable reality that family, often seen as a source of protection, can also become an incubator for brutality when power goes unchecked. Inessa Tarverdieva and Roman Podkopayev demonstrated how evil can be taught, rehearsed, and inherited, how loyalty when twisted can override conscience, and how partnership, when rooted in resentment, can transform the familiar into something lethal. As disturbing as their story is, the pattern does not end here, because the next duo would emerge not from family or ideology, but from youth, alienation, and a hunger for recognition. Russia, Irkutsk, early 2010s. If the previous case showed how violence could be taught inside a family, the partnership between Artyom Anufriev and Nikita Litkin revealed something different again. This was not inherited brutality. It was cultivated alienation. Two teenagers, disconnected from the world around them, who found validation not in belonging, but in hatred. Artyom Anufriev was the dominant personality. Intelligent, articulate, and deeply resentful, he grew up feeling rejected by those around him. From a young age, he struggled socially. Teachers noted his intelligence, but peers often kept their distance. Over time, that distance hardened into contempt. Anufriev began to see himself as superior, misunderstood, and justified in his anger. Nikita Litkin was younger, quieter, and far more emotionally dependent. He struggled with depression, isolation, and a sense of worthlessness. Where Anufriev expressed anger outward, Litkin turned it inward. He wanted connection. He wanted acceptance. And when he found it in Anufriev, he clung to it completely. Their friendship became exclusive. They withdrew from others and reinforced one another's grievances. Online forums, extremist content, and violent media became shared points of reference. Together, they constructed a worldview where humanity itself was the enemy. Misanthropy was not a phase. It became an identity. By the early 2010s, their conversations shifted from fantasy to planning. They began walking the streets of Irkutsk at night, armed with hammers, knives, and other improvised weapons. Their targets were not chosen for personal reasons. Victims were selected at random, elderly people, passers-by, strangers walking alone. The randomness was intentional. It reinforced their belief that anyone could be punished. The attacks were sudden and brutal. Victims were struck without warning, often from behind. The weapons were chosen for proximity, for intimacy. There was no attempt to escape responsibility within their own narrative. Violence was not hidden. It was celebrated between them. What distinguished this duo was documentation. Onufriev and Litkin recorded their crimes. They filmed attacks. They photographed bodies. They wrote manifestos. They wanted their actions to be seen, studied, and remembered. Not by authorities, but by those they imagined would understand them, like-minded individuals, future imitators. Between the early 2010s and their arrest, the pair murdered multiple people and seriously injured several others. Each attack escalated their confidence. Each success reinforced their bond. Fear became proof. Blood became validation. Witnesses later described how the pair moved together. Onufriev spoke. Litkin followed. When violence occurred, roles were clear. Onufriev initiated. Litkin assisted. Any hesitation was overridden by loyalty. Law enforcement initially struggled to identify a pattern. The victims had no connection. The locations varied. The weapons changed. It was only through forensic linkage and digital evidence that investigators began to understand they were dealing with a duo, not a lone offender. Their arrest brought an abrupt end to the spree. During interrogation, the hierarchy between them became unmistakable. Onufriev spoke confidently, framing the murders as ideological acts. He described hatred for humanity as rational, necessary. Litkin, in contrast, appeared emotionally unstable, oscillating between dependency and despair. He admitted participation, but framed his actions through Onufriev's influence. Psychological evaluations later reinforced this dynamic. Onufriev was described as narcissistic, ideologically rigid, and emotionally detached. Litkin was described as dependent, suggestible, and desperate for approval. Alone, either might have faltered. Together, they removed restraint entirely. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings, photographs, digital writings, physical evidence connecting them to multiple crime scenes. The documentation they had created to immortalize themselves became the very thing that condemned them. Onufriev received a life sentence. Litkin was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Years later, Litkin would die while incarcerated, ending his role in the story. Onufriev remains imprisoned, his ideology intact even as his freedom is gone. The public reaction in Russia was one of shock and discomfort, not because the violence was unprecedented, but because of who committed it: teenagers, students, young men who could have passed unnoticed in a crowd. Their case forced a national conversation about online radicalization, social isolation, and the dangerous power of mutual reinforcement. Artyom Onufriev and Nikita Litkin demonstrated how alienation can become lethal when it is shared rather than challenged, when resentment is echoed instead of questioned, when violence becomes a language spoken between two people who believe no one else is listening. Their story marked a grim shift, the rise of ideologically motivated youth violence, fueled not by organizations, but by companionship and digital echo chambers. A reminder that radicalization does not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly between friends. And as the timeline continues forward, the pattern changes once more. Because the next duo would not be driven by ideology or philosophy, but by thrill, attention, and a desire to kill together. A newly married couple, one meeting arranged online, and a crime that would shock an entire community. United States, Pennsylvania, early 2010s. If earlier killer duos were shaped by ideology, family control, or long-shared histories, the partnership between Miranda Barber and Elite Barber revealed something more unsettling in its simplicity. This was not a slow descent into violence. It was a choice, a deliberate decision made together, driven by thrill, validation, and the desire to experience murder as a shared act. Miranda Barber was young, emotionally volatile, and searching for identity. Her childhood was marked by instability, abuse, and neglect. She moved through foster care and fractured environments that offered little safety or consistency. Over time, trauma became central to how she understood herself. She did not want to be ordinary. She wanted to be significant, dangerous, seen. As she grew older, Miranda began constructing stories about herself that blurred truth and fantasy. She spoke of secret pasts, hidden violence, and identities that made her feel powerful. These narratives were not just exaggerations. They were tools, ways to command attention and shape how others perceived her. Elite Barber was different, quieter, less expressive. He struggled with direction and self-worth, drifting through early adulthood without a clear sense of purpose. He wanted stability, connection, and meaning. When he met Miranda, he found all three at once. She offered certainty. She offered intensity. She offered a story where he mattered. They married quickly. The relationship moved faster than understanding could keep up. To outsiders, they looked like many young newlyweds. Inside the relationship, however, something darker was forming. Conversations turned toward violence, toward killing, not metaphorically, literally. The idea was not introduced as a joke. It was presented as curiosity, as a test. Could they do it together? Would it make them closer? Would it prove something about who they were? Instead of rejecting the idea, they explored it. Miranda suggested using an online platform to find a victim. The anonymity offered control and distance. It created a space where intention could hide behind normality. She placed an advertisement offering companionship. A man responded. Messages were exchanged. A meeting was arranged. The plan was simple and deliberate. Miranda would meet the victim alone. Elite would hide in the back seat of the car. At a predetermined signal, they would act together. There was no personal grievance, no provocation. The victim was chosen because he was accessible and trusting. On the night of the murder, Miranda met the man in a public place. They spoke. They drove together. The interaction appeared calm and unremarkable. At a chosen moment, Miranda gave the signal. Elite emerged from hiding and wrapped a cord around the victim's neck. Miranda stabbed him repeatedly. The violence was swift, coordinated, and final. There was no hesitation, no panic. The act unfolded exactly as planned. What followed disturbed investigators more than the killing itself. They disposed of the body, they cleaned the vehicle, then they went out to eat. There was no visible distress, no shock. The murder had not fractured their bond. It had reinforced it. The act functioned as confirmation. They had done it together. When police began investigating, the couple initially denied involvement. But the trail was clear. Phone records, online messages, surveillance footage. The digital evidence dismantled their story piece by piece. During interrogation, Elite admitted what they had done. He stated plainly that they killed because they wanted to murder someone together. There was no attempt to justify it beyond that. No ideological framing, no financial motive. Miranda's statements were more erratic. She claimed responsibility for numerous other murders, describing a hidden history involving cults and ritual violence. None of these claims were substantiated. Investigators concluded that the stories were fabrications, extensions of the identity she had constructed for herself. Psychological evaluations later revealed a stark dynamic. Miranda was described as deeply troubled, prone to fantasy, and driven by a need for attention and control. Violence for her was part of self-creation. Elite was described as passive, dependent, and eager to please. He did not initiate the crime, but he did not resist it. Participation was his way of maintaining connection. At trial, the evidence left no room for doubt. The murder was premeditated, coordinated, and shared. Both pleaded guilty. Both received life sentences. Public reaction focused less on the brutality of the act and more on its motivation. There was no escalation, no history of violence, no clear external trigger. A life had been taken simply to satisfy curiosity and strengthen a bond. Their case highlighted a deeply unsettling truth, that sometimes the most dangerous partnerships are not built over years, but formed quickly through mutual reinforcement. When one person introduces an idea and the other removes the last hesitation, violence can emerge fully formed. Miranda Barbour and Elite Barbour demonstrated how the desire to be seen, validated, and connected can override empathy entirely, how violence can become a form of intimacy, how killing can be framed not as destruction, but as proof of unity. Their story stands apart not because of scale, but because of intent. A single life taken not out of rage or desperation, but as an experiment, a shared experience, a moment meant to define them forever. And as the timeline continues, the pattern shifts one final time, because the next duo would not be driven by thrill or fantasy, but by jealousy, entitlement, and betrayal. A young woman, a loyal accomplice, and a murder that would devastate a small community in a matter of hours. United States, Ohio, early 2020s. If the previous case showed how violence could be framed as thrill and intimacy, the partnership between Tristany Baker and Devin McNelly revealed something colder and more personal. This was not curiosity. It was resentment. Jealousy sharpened into entitlement, and entitlement hardened into a decision that could not be undone. Tristany Baker was young, volatile, and deeply unstable. Her childhood was marked by neglect, abuse, and constant displacement. She moved through foster homes without consistency or safety, learning early that relationships were fragile and conditional. By the time she reached adulthood, emotional regulation was almost non-existent. Anger came quickly. Obsession followed. Devin McNelly presented himself differently. Quieter and more restrained, he appeared functional on the surface. He held a job. He maintained social connections. But beneath that exterior was passivity, a tendency to avoid confrontation, a willingness to go along rather than push back. Where Baker demanded loyalty, McNelly provided it. Their relationship was turbulent and cyclical. Together, then apart. Arguments followed by reconciliation. Each separation intensified Baker's fear of abandonment. Each reunion reinforced the idea that control was possible if applied forcefully enough. Over time, Baker became fixated on perceived threats to the relationship. One of those perceived threats was a woman named Jayla Wyatt. Wyatt was not a stranger. She was someone Baker viewed as competition, someone who represented displacement and rejection. The jealousy was not fleeting. It grew into fixation. According to prosecutors, Baker became convinced that Wyatt needed to be removed, not confronted, not avoided. Removed. The plan was not impulsive. Baker obtained a firearm through McNelly. He did not pull the trigger, but he did not stop her. He supplied the weapon, he supplied transportation. Surveillance footage later showed them driving past Wyatt's residence repeatedly, watching, waiting, rehearsing. On the day of the murder, Baker arrived at Wyatt's apartment building, armed and prepared. She waited for hours, hiding nearby, monitoring movement. When this opportunity presented itself, she acted. Baker entered the apartment and opened fire. The first shot incapacitated. The following shots ensured finality. The violence was deliberate. There was no struggle, no provocation. This was execution. Afterward, Baker fled with McNelly. They hid the weapon. They attempted to distance themselves from the scene. Less than a day later, they were arrested. The speed of the investigation left little room for denial. During interrogation, Baker's behavior was erratic. At times, she expressed remorse. At others, she displayed disturbing detachment. Prosecutors later revealed recorded jail calls in which Baker mocked the situation and spoke about the murder without visible emotion. The contrast between courtroom tears and private conversations became a central point in sentencing. McNelly's role was quieter, but no less critical. He admitted knowing Baker's intent. He admitted providing the firearm and transportation. He admitted doing nothing. To prevent the crime, his defense centered on passivity rather than innocence. He claimed he was afraid to confront her, afraid to lose the relationship, afraid of escalation. The court did not accept fear as justification. At trial, the prosecution framed the crime as calculated and cold. Baker was described as the driving force, the planner, the executioner. McNelly was described as the enabler, the one who made the murder possible by choosing loyalty over responsibility. The victim's family spoke of loss that could not be measured. A life ended not by accident or desperation, but by obsession. The impact extended beyond grief. It rippled through the community, leaving anger, disbelief, and a sense of vulnerability behind. Sentencing reflected the severity of the crime. Tristani Baker received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court cited the calculated nature of the murder, her behavior after the fact, and the lack of credible remorse. Devin McNally received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after a lengthy minimum term, acknowledging his role as an accomplice rather than the shooter. Psychologists later described the partnership as asymmetrical. Baker exerted dominance through volatility and threat. McNally complied through avoidance and fear. Together, they formed a closed loop where escalation went unchallenged, where jealousy was validated, where violence became the solution. Unlike earlier killer duos driven by ideology or fantasy, this partnership was rooted in something painfully familiar: relationship insecurity, fear of replacement, the belief that another person's existence was an intolerable insult. Their case stands as a reminder that some of the most devastating acts of violence emerge not from grand narratives, but from personal entitlement, from the refusal to accept loss, from the belief that love can be enforced. Jayla Wyatt's death was not random. It was targeted, planned, enabled. Tristani Baker and Devin McNally showed how quickly obsession can turn lethal when reinforced instead of questioned, when one person decides and the other refuses to say no. Sometimes, the most dangerous partnerships are not built on ideology, thrill, or legacy. Sometimes they are built on jealousy. United States, South Carolina, mid-2010s. If the previous case showed how jealousy and entitlement could erupt into targeted violence, the partnership between Amy Velarde and Ross Velarde exposed something even more unsettling. This was not a crime of passion. It was a performance, a carefully maintained facade of grief, innocence, and community trust that concealed a crime rooted in proximity, patience, and deception. On the surface, Amy and Ross Velarde appeared ordinary, a married couple living on a rural property in South Carolina. They were part of a close-knit family network, surrounded by relatives who trusted them completely. There were no obvious warning signs, no public history of violence, no visible instability. That normality became their greatest shield. In the autumn of the mid-2010s, 4 members of Amy Velarde's extended family were brutally murdered inside their own home. The victims were elderly parents and a middle-aged couple, killed quickly and decisively. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle that suggested an outside intruder. Whoever committed the murders was either known to the victims or had been allowed inside willingly. Amy Velarde was the one who called authorities. When she spoke publicly in the days that followed, her grief appeared raw and convincing. She thanked the community for their prayers. She spoke of shock, confusion, and heartbreak. She condemned the killer, calling the murders vicious and senseless. Local media captured her words, her tears, and her apparent devastation. For years, the case remained unsolved. Investigators struggled to identify a suspect. The rural location offered few witnesses. Physical evidence was limited. The brutality of the crime suggested planning, yet there was no clear motive. The family was well known and well liked. There were no obvious enemies. Amy and Ross continued living on the same property, in a separate residence nearby. Life outwardly went on. Behind the scenes, suspicion never fully disappeared. Investigators noted inconsistencies, timelines that did not align perfectly, statements that raised questions rather than answered them. The absence of forced entry continued to trouble detectives. So did the precision of the killings. This was not chaotic violence. It was controlled. Years later, the investigation shifted. Advances in forensic analysis, combined with renewed scrutiny of those closest to the victims, brought Amy and Ross Velarde back into focus. What had once been unthinkable became unavoidable. The possibility that the killers were not outsiders, but family. When arrests were finally made, the shock was immediate and profound. The same couple who had spoken publicly about their grief were now charged with the murders themselves. 4 counts. No bond. The community reacted with disbelief. Friends and relatives struggled to reconcile the image they had known with the accusations now laid bare. For many, the betrayal felt as devastating as the crime itself. Authorities did not immediately disclose a clear motive. What mattered was proximity, opportunity, knowledge. The Velardes had access. They knew the property. They knew the victims' routines. They knew how to move without raising alarm. Equally disturbing was the performance that followed the murders. Amy Velarde's public statements were replayed, her words were re-examined. What once sounded like grief now sounded rehearsed. What once felt sincere now felt strategic. Investigators described the case as one of the most disturbing they had encountered, not because of the violence alone, but because of the deception that followed it. Psychologically, the partnership between Amy and Ross Velarde was defined by alignment. There was no clear dominant personality presented to the public. Instead, there was unity, silence, mutual reinforcement. Each protected the other through consistency and restraint. Unlike many killer duos, there were no confessions, no manifestos, no desire for notoriety. The goal was not recognition. It was disappearance into normal life. To commit the crime, then resume the role of grieving family members without drawing suspicion. This made the case uniquely chilling. The victims were not strangers, they were family. The crime scene was not distant or anonymous, it was home. Trust was not broken in the moment of violence alone, but repeatedly afterward, each time the Velardes spoke, lived, and mourned in public. As the legal process continues, many questions remain unanswered: motive, planning, individual roles. What is clear is that this was not an impulsive act. It was deliberate, calculated, and sustained through years of silence. Amy and Ross Velarde represent a form of evil that does not announce itself. It does not escalate publicly. It hides behind normalcy, patience, and performance. It relies on the assumption that familiarity equals safety. Their case serves as a reminder that some of the most devastating betrayals come not from outsiders, but from those closest to us. That violence does not always announce itself with chaos or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly and then waits. And with that, the pattern reaches its final form. Because when we look back across all these cases, one truth becomes unavoidable. The danger was never just the individual, it was the partnership. So, before you go, let me ask you one last thing. Where in the world are you watching from?